Okay. Next week's presentation by Dr. Kelly Randolph-Bennett, Meditation on the Go. Dr. Bennett says meditation is the most valuable skill he has learned. To practice it formally takes time, effort, and planning. In meditation, we intentionally develop our brain, mind, body, and soul to manifest universal perspectives where all possibilities exist. With more limited time, we can derive satisfaction from conversations with our source on the run, 24/7. He calls this dual attention. Two sides of your brain carry on two separate activities at the same time while connected to each other. Imagine that. With dual attention, the emphasis and intent are on unity with source, not on the practices. Dr. Kelly Bennett began his career as a rocket scientist. Over the past 55 years, he has helped individuals and businesses around the world flourish by applying clinical developmental, neuropsychology, brainwave optimization, meditation, and prayer as a psychologist and professor. He now resides with his wife, Charlie, in Ajijic, Mexico. So that's next week. This week's presentation, what brought you here, is by Tran, America's Children Displaced and Disadvantaged in Mexico. Amid an economic downturn, mass deportations, and intensifying anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, Mexican migrants have been forced to return to Mexico, and their U.S.-born family members have immigrated with them. The arrival of these Americans has contributed to an extraordinary growth of the U.S. population in Mexico, now home to more than 600,000 American children. While these children struggle to adapt to a new language, country, and education system, they are losing language and cultural ties to the United States. We know the vast majority plan to return home one day, but will they be prepared? Tran Dang, founder and executive director of the Rhizome Center for Migrants. She is a former large law firm attorney who has represented victims of persecution in regional human rights forums and systems, UNHRC, and the UN Special Procedures. In 2018, she founded the Rhizome Center for Migrants, a U.S. nonprofit providing post-deportation legal, advocacy, and reintegration support to the returned and deported community in western central Mexico. Please help me in welcoming Tran Dang.
Okay, well, it's been a little bit over a year since the last time I spoke at Open Circle, and it's really nice to be back in Ajijic, back on the lake, and back here in the garden. I want to thank Steve, who's not here today, and Diana for inviting me to speak again this year, and for all of you for being here. So I again am Tran Dang. I'm a native Texan. I'm the daughter of Vietnamese refugees. I've been a migrant here in Mexico for over 6 years. I'm a human rights attorney, and I'm the founder of the Rhizome Center for Migrants. We are a nonprofit in Guadalajara, so just up the road. Our organization serves deported Mexican migrants and their families. So today's talk, America's Children Displaced and Disadvantaged in Mexico, is about a particularly vulnerable migrant group that many of you may not be aware exists. Today's talk is about the precarious situation of U.S.-born children of Mexican migrants who've been brought here to Mexico by their parents. Before I jump into kind of why some U.S. children are in a precarious situation here in Mexico, I want to quickly give you some context and background on how the Rhizome Center for Migrants serves the deported, and how that work has led us to advocate for U.S. citizen children here in Mexico. The Rhizome Center for Migrants is a U.S. Texas-based nonprofit. Our organization serves the deported, so really people who have lived in the United States for most of their lives, people whose ties, experiences, or time to live there places them in a situation of precarity due to their inability to access human, essential, and legal rights. The Rhizome Center for Migrants was founded during the first years of the Trump administration, when we began to see, as we have and many times in U.S. history, stricter immigration enforcement priorities that as a result increased the number of people being deported from the United States, and particularly from the interior of the United States. The Rhizome Center for Migrants was founded to provide U.S. legal resources here in Mexico to deported migrants and their families. Since our founding, our organization's legal work has focused on immigration, family law, labor benefits, including VA benefits and Social Security, documentation assistance, and post-conviction relief. Many of our deported clients are disoriented and bewildered when they arrive in Mexico. They may be unfamiliar with the Mexican system and often need assistance to obtain basic documents, including the birth certificate, voter registration card, or INE, their national ID number, or PORT, and their passports. After their deportation, they may need assistance enrolling in healthcare and retirement programs. We also help the deported to look for educational opportunities, including adult education, accelerated high school programs, job opportunities, and opportunities for career advancement. In a nutshell, we are there for migrants as they reestablish themselves in Mexico and seek to regain mobility and autonomy in their lives. In addition to helping the deported get back on their feet again, the Rhizome Center for Migrants advocates for the creation of resources and durable solutions that address the greatest needs of the returned and deported community, including the right to family and to family life, the right to return to the United States, and the right to freedom of movement. As a U.S. organization operating on this side of the border, we recognize that we are among one of the few organizations in the world with direct access to deported migrants. We understand better than any U.S. organization the unique issues and needs of the deported community. A significant part of our work entails sharing data and analysis of the long-term consequences of deportation, as well as promoting and supporting U.S. policy recommendations that consider the deported and their families and have the potential to improve the lives of the people we serve. Through our work with the returned and deported, we've come to learn of the very urgent needs of U.S.-born children who've emigrated from the United States to Mexico with their Mexican parents. Today's talk, America's Children, Displaced and Disadvantaged in Mexico, is about the persistent disadvantages they experience in Mexico following their parents' deportation or return. Of the estimated 600,000 U.S. children now in Mexico, over 287,000 struggle to obtain legal status. They've not been able to access education, healthcare, and other basic rights and services. While a significant number of the estimated 600,000 American children live at the border, a large number also live in rural areas, some in primarily indigenous states, where they experience challenging social conditions and abject poverty, sometimes living without basic utilities like running water. In today's presentation, I will briefly explain the circumstances of their arrival, what we know about them, and the specific struggles they experience that make them a particularly vulnerable migrant group in need of societal and government support. I'll also talk about their future plans to return to the United States and the future reintegration challenges they will likely face. What I will share today is based on academic reports, my experience representing U.S. citizens, and research conducted by the Rhizome Center for Migrants on their circumstances here in Mexico and their current and future needs. So there are now more than 600,000 children who are enrolled in Mexican schools. When did they arrive, and what do we know about them? In the last 20 years, we've seen a significant increase in the size of the U.S. population in Mexico, mostly driven by the increase in the number of U.S.-born children of Mexican migrants now on this side of the border. Since 2005, more than 3 million Mexicans have returned to Mexico due to unfavorable economic circumstances, familial obligations, and changes to and stricter enforcement of U.S. immigration law and policies, including deportation. As Mexican migrants are forced out of the United States, their departure has entailed the simultaneous and often not fully voluntary immigration of American children and spouses to Mexico. The arrival of U.S. family members has contributed to an extraordinary growth of the U.S. population in Mexico, with Mexico now outpacing Canada and the European Union as home to the largest U.S. citizen population outside of the United States. According to the U.S. State Department, which does not track people leaving the country, an estimated 1.6 million Americans live in Mexico. We know that more than 600,000 and possibly more than 1 million are the U.S. family members of Mexican migrants, a population the size of Delaware. This growing population was first noted by academic scholars who became aware of the sudden growth of the U.S. citizen population in the early 2000s when Mexican public schools began filling up with U.S. citizen kids. Early scholars, including Victor Zuniga and Edmund Hamann, who studied their reception in Mexican institutions, noted that the heightened representation of U.S.-born children in Mexican schools created unexpected challenges for Mexican educators untrained for a culturally diverse classroom. This is still the case today. Mexican schools have remained unprepared to receive U.S. educated children as they continue to represent one of the fastest growing populations in the Mexican education system. Academics have been studying this U.S. population for nearly 15 years now. Some commonly cited numbers regarding their size include a study using 2015 Mexican intercensal data that conservatively estimates that there are 600,000 U.S.-born children enrolled in school, making up approximately 3% of the total K-12 population. There's evidence that that population is climbing. In a more recent study conducted in 2017 and 2018, the study found that there were U.S. citizens now made up 4% of the national sixth grade population. So if you extrapolate that percentage across all grade levels, then you will see that the size of the U.S. population has quadrupled since scholars first estimated the population in 2008. That's significant, and I expect that that number will grow. Today in the United States, there are still an estimated 4.9 million undocumented Mexican migrants. Without legalization options or other remedies, they will continue to return or face deportation, and their U.S. citizen children and family members will continue to be impacted and forced to leave the United States. It's important to note that the 600,000 estimate relies on Mexican school administrative data. So it doesn't include the substantial population that is at the border. A lot of families choose to live at the border so that their children can continue to cross the border every day and attend school in the United States. If there's a U.S. citizen wife in the picture, usually it's the wife, then she would also be able to cross the border and earn U.S. dollars. And so the 600,000 number does not include that population. It also doesn't include the population of kids who have not been able to enroll in school. We know that there are 287,000 who don't have the proper paperwork to register in Mexico, legalize in Mexico, or attend school. Again, no accurate count of the total U.S. citizen population, but we do know that there are 600,000 enrolled in school. What we've learned from academics who have studied the integration of U.S. children in Mexican schools is that the population of U.S. children is not homogeneous. In a typical Mexican classroom, you might see American children with vastly different Spanish language abilities, for example. Some children arrive in Mexico with very rudimentary Spanish. You also have other children who now feel more comfortable with Spanish than English, as well as children who never learned English. You'll also see varying U.S. schooling experience. For example, there are children who were born in the United States but never attended school there, or attended only early grades. Some children have had significant school experience and are coming to Mexico and re-entering school in junior high or high school. Some children have had multiple migratory experiences in which they entered the Mexican school system more than once, or the U.S. school system more than once. U.S.-born children have different family experiences. Kids who are not living with both parents in Mexico, maybe living with relatives or only one parent, while the other parent and maybe older siblings continue to live in the United States for economic reasons. A similar subset of U.S. children in Mexico have a U.S. parent, usually a U.S. mom. In these cases, the family has, in almost all cases, left the United States because of deportation. Children with at least one U.S. parent tend to have a higher standard of living, while most kids, particularly those living in rural areas, tend to live in impoverished conditions under very difficult social circumstances. What's important to note here is that there is no one profile of the American child in Mexico, but almost all American children, regardless of their taxonomy, do plan to return to the United States one day. The Rhizome Center for Migrants first began assisting U.S. citizen children of Mexican migrants when we were contacted last year by an organization in Guanajuato and referred a number of cases of U.S. citizen kids who had been in Mexico for more than 5 years and had not been able to obtain a court. For short-term travelers and those who don't mind doing a visa run every 6 months, not having a court is not really a problem. But it does become a problem for families and individuals who are settling in Mexico and need access to government services. Most of you probably have a CORP. For those of you who don't, a CORP is a unique identifier, like a social security number that's assigned to Mexican nationals and residents. A CORP is needed to open a bank account, access health care, access daycare, use a community center, apply for jobs, and apply for other government identification. Without a permanent CORP, American children have had difficulties enrolling in high school or even taking a permanent placement exam to complete elementary school or junior high school. Although Mexican authorities are supposed to provide a provisional CORP for kids grades K through 9, some kids have not been able to enroll despite. Why are there so many kids in Mexico who can't obtain a CORP or enroll in school? It's a really good question, and it boils down to usually one of two things. One, the parent can't register the child's birth in Mexico because the family doesn't have access to the child's U.S. birth certificate, or they don't know how or can't meet the eligibility requirements to request a U.S. birth certificate from Mexico. A second reason this tends to happen is because of the difference in naming conventions between the United States and Mexico. Sometimes Mexicans use shorter versions of their name and will include, for example, only the paternal last name in their documentation in the United States, including the birth certificates of their children. So, for instance, Sylvia Alma Ramirez Lopez might have used the name Sylvia Alma Ramirez on the child's birth certificate, which would then be rejected by most civil registries in Mexico, and the child is then unable to show proof of relationship to the Mexican parent, and without having their birth certificate corrected, they can never gain legal status in Mexico. This is an absurd outcome, of course, because under Mexican citizenship law, the U.S.-born children of Mexican migrants are actually considered Mexican by birth. But they can't prove their relationship to the parents and can never legalize. As a result, you see U.S. citizen kids in various legal status in Mexico, including dual citizen for those who are able to, no status, temporary resident, and permanent resident. Some children enter the country as tourists and have remained in that status for years. Not only are these children considered foreigners with no legal status in Mexico, they must leave the country every 6 months when a tourist visa expires. Or they don't leave and they just overstay. This is, of course, a huge financial burden for families that are barely making ends meet. Without a way to legalize and without a way to obtain a court, some U.S. children in Mexico remain in a state of legal limbo, in which they have no legal rights in the country where they live, and they are unable to continue their education. Their inability to gain access to education affects their long-term socioeconomic status and future opportunities. The Rhizome Center for Migrants Legal Aid Clinic is helping American kids to gain legal status by correcting their U.S. birth certificates so that they reflect their parents' full legal name in Mexico. This is a U.S. state-level legal process that can take up to a year or longer and may require a court order. In addition to providing U.S. solutions, we're also looking into the possibility of bringing litigation here in Mexico to require schools to accept students and issue them a diploma regardless of their legal status. This year, the Rhizome Center for Migrants was commissioned by the Center for the United States and Mexico at the Baker Institute of Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, to produce a policy report examining the circumstances of U.S. citizens in Mexico and potential solutions that could protect their rights and ability to thrive on either side of the border. As part of that field research, I conducted in-depth phone and home interviews with 10 U.S. citizen wives, ages 33 to 54, and also 11 Americans brought to Mexico as children, now ages 13 to 32. The individuals interviewed represent 15 families who immigrated to Mexico between 1994 and 2020 from Washington, California, Texas, Missouri, Minnesota, Tennessee, Michigan, and Connecticut. They now live across rural and urban areas in western central Mexico, including Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacan, in areas of the country where the U.S. State Department either advises U.S. citizens not to travel due to crime or crime and kidnapping. While these Americans do not live at the border, where their experience would be much different and perhaps easier in a way, what I learned was telling. Though the report hasn't been published, I'll highlight the circumstances of 4 children I interviewed today. Their profiles were included in this presentation because their circumstances represent a phenomenon happening at a large scale, of which neither the United States or Mexico seems to be aware, and neither country has taken a policy position. When I interviewed Jasmine in Guanajuato, I spoke to Jasmine and her mother. There's not a father in the picture. The two have been living alone outside of San Miguel de Allende in a basic home with no running water, essentially off the side of the highway. Not only are they outside of town, but they're also disconnected from other homes and families. Jasmine's family was by far the most impoverished of the families that I visited. Jasmine moved to Mexico to be with her mom. She's originally from Texas and arrived in 2016, so 6 years ago. When Jasmine came to Mexico, she thought that things were going to be better because she would be with her mom. But things turned out very differently than she had expected. Although she's fluent in Spanish now, she wasn't when she arrived. And she had a lot of difficulty in school with kids bullying her and making her feel inferior and lesser than because she didn't speak Spanish. She's been unable to obtain a CURP, even today, because her mother's name on her U.S. birth certificate did not include her full name. Though Jasmine was able to enroll in a private religious school and completed grades 6 through 9, she's not been able to obtain certification of her completion because her school is not associated with CEP, the Department of Education of Mexico. Since 2020, for over 2 years now, she's been denied the possibility to take a placement exam and enroll in high school. She's 16, and she hasn't started high school. Since she was forced to drop out of school, Jasmine has been working and helping her mother sell pulque at certain tianquis in town. Her day starts at 4 a.m. when she and her mom get up to collect miel from the agave plants on the property where they live, and they begin the fermentation process. They then bottle up the pulque and head to the market to sell it. By the time the day is over, Jasmine is exhausted and she still needs to help her mom cook and get ready for the next day. I had the opportunity to go to work with Jasmine and her mother and continue the interview in their home. Given Jasmine's terrible school experience, I wasn't sure what she would say when I asked her what she wanted to be and what she wanted to do with her life. To my surprise, she answered without any hesitation that she had always wanted to be a criminologist. And then she picked up a tattered book off of her desk on criminology and showed it to me. And that for her represented what she saw as her future. Like many other children, Jasmine would like to return to the United States one day. She's conflicted because her mother will not be able to go with her. Her mother is all that she has, and it's unclear what Jasmine's future will look like considering the family's socioeconomic situation. Though her mother wants her to finish school, she can't afford to send her to school. And due to the difficulty Jasmine has had obtaining an apostilled copy of her U.S. birth certificate, an extra legalization process that gives her birth certificate validity outside the United States, Jasmine has been unable to apply for a U.S. passport and cannot even travel to the country where she has citizenship and can access rights as a U.S. citizen. So that's Jasmine. When I interviewed Alex, who also lives in the San Miguel Allende area, I learned how complex families can affect the rights and future of Americans who were not themselves deported, but experienced the full brunt of deportation just as their parents do. Alex is 13 years old. He's from Missouri. Unlike the other American children I interviewed, both of Alex's parents are U.S. citizens. After Alex was born, his parents' relationship ended, and his mother remarried to a Mexican national who was undocumented and was later deported. Alex didn't want to be separated from his stepfather, who he loves very much, and their family moved to Mexico in 2020. Although the family lives in a fairly touristy area, they live in the middle of San Miguel de Allende, Alex still sticks out because there are not many white American children who live there, and not many children with blonde and blue eyes. I was really touched by Alex's story and the stories of other children like him who are the step or adopted children of deported migrants. They carry the weight of deportation as if they themselves have been deported. Unlike other children I met, Alex doesn't speak Spanish, and he seems very out of place. Because he doesn't speak Spanish, he's been homeschooled and has no interaction with any other children his age. When I asked him if there was anything that worried him about living in Mexico, he responded that he fears the cartels and never knows if his family is safe. He said that he misses the United States very much and wants to return home one day. Like many of the children I spoke to, these were not things that they shared with their parents. Stephanie. I later had the opportunity to interview families in Morelia, Michoacan, and I met Stephanie. Stephanie is an American who's originally from California. She was brought to Mexico as a child. She's now 32. And she has spent almost her entire life in Mexico, all of her formative years, all of her adult years. She's college educated, and she has a well-paying job in Mexico. However, since she had her daughter, also an American citizen, she's thinking about returning to the United States. She wants her daughter to attend school there. They're looking for a safe place to be, but they're not really sure kind of what that reintegration will look like, what that transition will look like. Unlike some Americans in Mexico, Stephanie still has family ties in California, but she doesn't speak English and doesn't really understand kind of what what that transition is going to look like for her, particularly as someone now in her 30s who will be looking to enter the U.S. labor market and hopefully have a similar job without speaking English. We talked about what would be required for her to revalidate her studies in the United States and whether she would be able to find similar work after crossing the border. We also talked about what documentation her daughter would need, including a vaccination card so that she'll be able to enroll in school and gain access to daycare. Again, she seems really excited about returning home, but doesn't really know what to expect. And in many cases like hers, though they are U.S. citizens, the services they need are very much similar to the services that refugees would need when they receive their orientation. Kind of, how do you access banks? What is transportation like? How do you find jobs? How do you sign up for health care, etc. This last profile is of Israel. In Morelia, I met a 15-year-old boy named Israel who has 2 sisters and brothers. They're also U.S. citizens, and they were all brought to Mexico as children. Israel has lived in Mexico most of his life, but he feels a deep connection to the United States. He's currently in high school. He's finishing up his last year, and like many other kids with a U.S. passport, he's weighing his future and factoring in a life in the United States. Israel is currently, again, his last year, and he is eager to join the U.S. Army. That really surprised me. He wasn't the only child I spoke to who wanted to serve the United States. He doesn't speak English, and he doesn't have access to Army recruiters, and doesn't really know what to expect when he returns home and doesn't have a home to go to. Unlike Stephanie, Israel does not have family members in the United States. It's unclear if Israel and his mother will be able to live on the same side of the border, because as with many of his kids, he has a parent who's been deported and may not be able to re-enter the United States. The Americans I spoke to, including Stephanie, Israel, Alex, and who was the first one? Jasmine. These kids are among or represent the more than 600,000 Americans in Mexico. In studies and in my interviews with these Americans, one thing is very clear. They all plan to return to the United States one day, whether to work or to study. After spending a significant amount of time outside the United States, whether due to their family's voluntary return or deportation, many have lost their language, cultural, and social ties to the United States. They experience a lower standard of living here in Mexico and don't always have access to health care. Due to difficulties enrolling in school, many children experience low education attainment, which will have a long-term effect on their opportunities later in life, whether they work in the United States or Mexico. Without proper documentation, many of these children cannot even access their rights as U.S. citizens because they cannot enter the United States and they cannot access basic rights or government services in Mexico. Some kids continue to be undocumented, invisible by both countries. The Rhizome Center for Migrants views these children as particularly vulnerable because they are unseen by either country. The U.S. does not have a diaspora policy that includes them, and Mexico has done very little to ensure that the children of Mexican migrants who are constitutionally Mexican by birth have access to their rights and privileges as Mexican citizens. Without support from their government, they are both displaced and disadvantaged. While the Rhizome Center for Migrants supports their legal claims to change their birth certificates so that they can legalize and enroll in school, we're also raising awareness and visibility about their situation and pushing for policy changes that can create resources for them while they are in Mexico. We're also looking at their U.S. reintegration needs and making recommendations to institutions and agencies in the United States who will receive them when they return. What's going to be critical in this case is that they receive the government support and services they need so that they can thrive on whichever side of the border they choose to live. that pretty much concludes my presentation. I know I always get questions about how you all can help. If you're interested in sort of learning more and following the work of the organization, you're welcome to follow us on Facebook. We're at fb.com/Rhizome Center. That's RHIZOME. I often get questions about why we're called a Rhizome Center for Migrants. What is a rhizome? It's a botanical term describing a type of root that can grow additional roots or shoots. And that really symbolizes the work that we're trying to do in terms of helping people to settle and thrive again. For those of you who are interested in donating and supporting our work, you can do so through PayPal. Our email address there is give@rhizomecenter.org. If you know U.S. citizen children who are in this situation, please reach out to me. And I'm happy to do an intake and to talk to them at our office in Guadalajara. My email address, for those of you listening or writing it down, is tran.dang@rhizomecenter.org. Finally, the policy report that I mentioned will likely be published before the end of the summer, and so if you'd like a copy of that, please email. I also have business cards I can pass around. And so this is actually my favorite part, the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this work. So if you'd like to ask a question, you feel like your voice is good and loud, you can stand up and do so. I'll point to you. We'll start with you.
Thank you for your talk. You obviously have a deep relationship with the consulate in Guadalajara, and I'm wondering if you can tell us about their helpfulness in moving your cause to higher levels within the U.S. government.
So right now with the policy recommendation, or the report, we'll be making specific recommendations to the U.S. State Department about what they can do to better protect. Oops, sorry. Not you. Oh, it's you. But yeah, we will be in discussions with the State Department on what they can better do to protect U.S. citizens in Mexico. A lot of that's going to require additional resources. So we're really going to look for a budget proposal in D.C. We're actually, and I didn't mention it, but as part of our sort of narrative collection project, we really want to hear from these kids. On Dia del Niño, the Rhizome Center for Migrants celebrated by organizing a writing contest for the children of Mexican migrants, asking them to reflect on their experience as U.S. citizens in Mexico and to respond to the specific prompt, what does U.S. citizenship mean to you? The U.S. State Department, we'll see kind of who will represent, but have agreed to attend the awards ceremony for those children, at which the representative, hopefully the consul or ambassador, will provide a personal response to the children about what U.S. citizenship means to them. So we do have a relationship and we are working on this issue.
Yes, in the far back.
That's great that you're working with the executive branch of the United States government. What are you doing on the congressional side? Have you identified any champions who can advocate for you with the State Department and with other members of Congress to bring this issue to light?
On the issue of U.S. children, we are in the process of identifying potential champions. Once we have the concrete sort of policy recommendations, we will be approaching members of Congress to find support, which shouldn't be controversial, but we'll see. We'll see. The U.S. State Department, because the funding is an issue. And for example, one of the things that we would like to see happen is that the U.S. passport fee be greatly reduced or waived completely, considering a family's economic situation. The passport fee is between $135 and $165 for U.S. citizen kids. It's the same no matter where you live in the world. It's for Mexican families, extremely difficult to pay that. That's one of the things we would like to request, but I do understand that the passport fees and all immigration fees are what fund those departments and those services.
Anybody else? Yes.
Central America or South America?
Did everybody hear her question?
Repeat it, please.
You want to repeat it?
Oh, she asked how many of the children at the border may be from Central America or South America. So the number that was quoted earlier was 600,000, and that number includes the school-age children who are enrolled in school in Mexico. So they're U.S. citizens. I don't know how many Central Americans and South Americans are at the border, other nationalities. There are bottlenecks there now, people who are unable to enter the United States to seek asylum and are stuck at the border. There are, and I actually don't have any information about this, but I'm sure that there are people who have been deported from the United States who may be from Central America or South America who may be living in Mexico now with their U.S. citizen kids. I don't know what that number is.
What does housing look like at the border? Do they have refugee camps or is it tents or is it
You want,
housing? What does it look like?
she's asking what housing looks like at the border. What kind of, are they refugee camps or how are they living?
For U.S. citizens, they're probably not living in refugee camps or migrant shelters. Those are usually, well, not the refugees. Some have lived in refugee camps for a really long time. But for those who are in migrant shelters, they're usually temporary accommodation. And for U.S. citizens who are here, who have a settled life here, they likely live in apartments or homes, some kind of housing at the border.
Anybody else? Yes.
What's your organization look like on the U.S. side as far as offices and personnel and versus what does it look like in Mexico?
Our organization is a Texas-based nonprofit, but our office and our operations are here in Guadalajara. It's a small operation. We do have board members and volunteers and people who support our organization on both sides of the world, both sides of the world, both sides. It seems that way sometimes, both sides of the border, and we rely kind of heavily on volunteers. But I'm the primary person on the ground in Guadalajara. We actually have someone here today who's joining us, Gerardo, who's actually a DACA law student from Texas, who is... Hello. Gerardo is a DACA law student from St. Mary's School of Law who's here and joining our legal team for the summer.
Great. Yes.
When American American-born children decide to accompany their deported parents back to Mexico, are they essentially put on the plane and flown to Mexico with their parents, or they have to reunite after the fact?
They reunite after the fact. So oftentimes people don't know when their loved ones will be deported. They'll just be deported one day, and then the families have to scramble. Sometimes if it's a voluntary departure, the person who is leaving the United States will know, and the families in those situations are obviously in a much better situation and can plan. In those circumstances, usually it's the wife who's feverishly, selling their homes, their assets, everything they have, so that they can make the move down south. Usually people will drive. It's a more economical one, plus they want to bring their cars. And sometimes people drive without stopping, and so some people are in the United States undocumented without ever having legalized their status. I don't think that they would be deported, but they could be deported. They are deportable. Yes?
I'm wondering for the kids who are not able to get into school and with those attacks and difficulties, if there was an alternative Zoom schooling, like homeschooling for others.
That's something that kind of...
Wait just a second. Her question is about alternative schooling for those children that can't be enrolled in schools, possibly a Zoom school or education.
Yeah, it seems to me that kind of the families who have been able to find alternatives are the families where there is one U.S. citizen parent who's able to try to kind of figure that process out. So several of the kids I spoke to who haven't been able to register are in these sort of alternative schooling options that are not necessarily approved by SEP. which means they have to go through additional certification programs. But there are kids who are being homeschooled, so doing online classes at a U.S. homeschool program. There are kids in religious schools. There are kids who are in other private schools. Of course, that's a much more costly alternative and not one that many of the families can do. Aside from that, Jasmine, for example, she's a 16-year-old. Even if she could get into high school at this point, I don't know that she would. Who wants to start high school and finish high school at age 20? So for someone like her, an option might be that she tests out of high school, if she can get a CORP, and take the certification exam with SEP, or she could try to study for the GED and take that. So there are options, but most people are not aware of them. They're obviously difficult for children to have to receive their schooling that way. They completely miss out on the schooling experience. Yes.
He's asking what motivated her to get involved with this.
What makes you think it's not easy? Well, I've been in Mexico now for 6 years, and when I first got here, I was doing human rights work in other areas, including gender violence, asylum work, indigenous and land rights, and I ultimately moved to Guadalajara in 2000, and I think it was 17 or 18. At that time, again, it was at the beginning of the Trump administration, and kind of really hard to watch from this side of the border. Because we live in this area in Jalisco and in one of the traditionally migrant-sending states, in Mexico, a lot of people you meet are people who have lived in the United States at one point or have been deported. The train La Bestia passes through Guadalajara. It's a huge migrant hub for all kinds of migrants, not just returning migrants, but also refugees, people seeking asylum. Like if you go into any migrant shelter today, they're full of patients. And so kind of realizing that Guadalajara is a sort of migrant center and important in the narrative in Mexico on migration. So started, asking around to see kind of what exists for people. As an American, I want to know kind of what happens to people after they've been deported, and realized that there really aren't any services, really aren't any programs. This population, not just their children, but also people who've been deported and returned are also invisible to their country. There is not a policy, despite the millions of people who've been affected, and the violations of their human rights, their inability to access family, their inability to return to the United States. It's something that I felt as an American that I had a responsibility to do something, and as an attorney I decided to start a legal aid center.